believes that the less government intervention in the economy, the better. And we've got some lovely speakers for you. On side proposition, we have Dr. Eamon Butler, who is director and co-founder of the Adam Smith Institute, and Rory Meakin from the Taxpayers Alliance. And on opposition, we present to you today Leander Jones of BPDR at the Guild, and our very own Dr. Peter Kerr, who I think needs no introduction, but we'll find out later. Fantastic. Before we kick off then, a few things. So we're hosting this debate today in collaboration with both Broad Left and the Free Society. I think both of those societies would like to say a couple of things. Would they? You don't have to.
Yeah, can do. Hi, I'm from the University of Birmingham's Broad Left Society. Basically a society that encompasses anyone who would consider themselves left-wing. We debate various issues, we get outside speakers in, we watch documentaries, we go on trips to theatres, and it's a forum for discussing everything from the economy to the environment, imperialism, war and conflict, gender issues, so anything. So yeah, if you'd like to come along to any of our future events, please feel free. You can find us on Facebook, just search University of Birmingham Broad Left Society. And I think our next event is going to be a film about the Greek debt crisis after reading week on Tuesday. Okay.
There you are.
Really sound bad and certified, so if you're interested, come along and you can find us on Facebook.
Fantastic. So if we now take a vote on where people currently stand on the motion, so the purpose of this vote is so that we can calculate at the end of the debate who has won based on how many people have changed their minds, rather than just like what people thought in the room anyway. And then it looks, then the debate matters and stuff to who wins the debate, which seems like a reasonable way of conducting things. So we'll be taking votes in proposition, opposition, or in abstention, like if you're not sure. So the motion is that this House believes that the less government intervention in the economy, the better. Hands up if you think you are in proposition. Fantastic, hands down then please, and hands up if you think that you are in opposition.
I think we should stay away from the physical fight.
Cool, and anybody who is undecided, they would like to vote in abstention. Lovely. Thanks very much for your vote. So without further ado then, hang on, some further ado. So just to remind everybody that obviously this room is very full. That means that probably lots of you will be wanting to make speeches in the kind of audience speeches time. In order for that to be really any time and for people to get to make speeches, we have to get through other people making speeches, like people on the panel. That gets significantly hampered when people do lots and lots of heckling and stuff, however fun that may or may not be. So if I could ask you all to try to restrain yourselves, however much you may want to shout things out, and have faith in the fact that you will have your chance to make contributions. That time will come. and you can, like, write those thoughts down rather than letting us all know them at once whilst everyone else is trying to speak. That would be lovely if you could do that for me. As I say, don't really want to go shouting. So, fantastic. So, yeah, now, without any further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Eamon Butler to propose the case today.
Thank you very much. It's a very easy proposition, so it won't actually take very long for me to propose the case, which is, of course, just as well, because many years ago I promised myself that I would never speak in public longer than I could make love in private. So in conclusion, let me just say that we on our side are not saying that there should be absolutely no intervention in the economy, just as I'm sure the opposition are not saying that there should be 100% intervention in the economy. We're just saying that less is generally better, that if there's a choice, you should probably err on the side of less intervention rather than more. When you look at intervention around the world and countries which are more interventionist, you find that countries which have a larger involvement of the state in their economy tend to grow less. Whereas those with more state intervention, less intervention grow faster and better. It's the difference between Luxembourg and Singapore and Hong Kong versus, Zimbabwe, Yemen, Kyrgyzstan, Vietnam. That's the difference. So economically, less intervention is a good thing. That, I think, is no surprise. What you've got to remember about economic intervention is that it is done by these guys. It's done by politicians. And the trouble with that is that politicians are basically, they're no good. And the opposition says that, well, the market fails all the time and therefore the government will have to step in. But the problem is not so much that the market fails, the problem is that it's politics which fails, and that is the problem of intervention. The problem is government failure. The opposition's mistake is to assume that interventions are made objectively and in the public interest. Well, they're not. They are made politically by people who are politically motivated. Elections are not a way of trying to find out what the public interest is. They are, in fact, a competition between different interests. That interest groups come forward and they put their own case for spending here or spending there. They want cash, they want favours from the government. Elections are an advance auction for stolen property. And politicians pander to that. They pander to the interest groups that are going to get them elected because they've got to get elected, and therefore they promise all kinds of goodies to particular interest groups. In other words, the motivation behind intervention is fundamentally corrupt. This is a process which is done by a political machinery which itself is venal. And I think that politicians don't even make good decisions. Ministers move around. They can't become expert on their particular field. They last for a couple of years and then they're replaced by somebody else. How can they possibly make decent decisions about economic management or anything else for that matter? They're not interested in the next generation. They're interested in the next election. And that's why we've got over-borrowing and overspending. It's why we're spending vast wadges of cash on stuff which you people will actually have to pay for. That's the evil of it, that it will be your generation who has to pay higher taxes in order to keep us in socks. People, it seems to me, make their own decisions better than politicians and bureaucrats make them for them. People have more information about their own circumstances. They know what's good for them. They know their own local circumstances. Their information is more up to date. They know what's happening around them better than politicians, because information has to be passed up to the central planners and then passed back down again. That all takes time, but we know what our circumstances are, and our circumstances change from hour to hour and minute to minute. Politics can't possibly be as efficient at dealing with those kind of information problems. And our information is more personal. We know what our values are. We know what our hopes and our aspirations and our dreams are. I don't think that George Osborne necessarily knows what our values and our aspirations and our dreams are. Politicians cannot know. They are too distant from the action. So politicians, in other words, are trying to deal with these problems with less information than ordinary people have, less up-to-date information, less personal information than the people that they're actually making these choices for. That's the evil of interventionism. The reality of political decision-making is that there is no clear public interest. There is, in fact, a lot of competing interest. That's what elections are all about. And in politics, it's the 51% who decide. And that's not necessarily a good way to decide, because it's like two wolves and a sheep deciding what they should have for lunch. If the majority, you've got to get a majority of the population and a majority of the seats, and then you've got to get a majority in the House of Commons. A few people, in other words, can dictate policy. That is not, in my judgment, a good system, and the 49% can be exploited. The bigger the government is, the more intervention you have, the bigger the government is, the higher the stakes are. The more cash, the more power there is for people to fight over. So the larger that government becomes, the more it becomes dominated by interest group politics rather than by open market cooperation and collaboration. And that's why interventions are so often counterproductive. You know, look at the hideous United States intervention in the mortgage market, where they were forcing banks, since Jimmy Carter, sorry, is that my time? Yeah. Where they were forcing banks to lend to people that the banks knew were not very good credit risks. That's the whole subprime debacle. That is why we are in a crisis right now. Intervention stifles competition. You have all of these regulations. Big firms can afford them. Big firms love them. Big firms want them because it keeps out the competition, because small firms can't afford it. So, in our view, the market is not the law of the jungle. The market is intelligent. It is motivated by individuals making their own decisions. All you need from government is to preserve the rules of the market, which are very simple: property, honesty, contract. The more that government intervenes, the more it loses sight of this essential role. Government does have a role, but that is its core role. Don't lose sight of it. And in our judgment, competition is the best regulator. So please vote for our own right to decide our own things without politicians like him deciding it for us. Thank you very much.
Politicians like me, lol. I'm going to outline just one simple mechanism of the market system, and then I'm going to briefly explain how this has massive implications for the economy, for society, and also for the environment, something which is often neglected in these sorts of debates. The most I can hope to do today is to scratch the surface of the issue, but hopefully this scratch will expose the malignant poison that lies underneath an unrestrained free market. The mechanism behind my argument is the logic of competitive capital accumulation. To attract custom and survive in the market, businesses must ensure that their products can compete with other products in terms of quality and price. They do this through investment in capital, so they can produce more with the same inputs, as well as through cost-cutting measures. As every business will do the same, the result is an overall increase in the output relative to inputs. This lowers the price of the product due to great supply, perpetuating a cycle. And business owners who do not manage to do these things will not be able to remain competitive. These businesses will go bust and be swallowed up, and their capital bought up by surviving businesses. This imperative necessitates cutting costs for inputs, including labour. However, to quote the political economist Karl Polanyi, the alleged commodity labour power cannot be shoved about, used indiscriminately, or even left unused without affecting also the human individual who happens to be the bearer of this peculiar commodity. In disposing of a man's labour power, the system would, incidentally, dispose of the physical, psychological, and moral entity man attached to that tag. Apologies for gender language. More kind-hearted business owners who do not want to exploit their workers will struggle to maintain profit levels and to stay afloat. The use and abuse of child and sweatshop labour in the third world is well known. But did you know that in the Western world, despite claims of victorious GDP growth, wages over the last 30 years have frozen and in some sectors declined? Today's workers work 160 hours more than they did 25 years ago per year in order just to stay afloat. As the process of competitive capital accumulation continues, as businesses are subsumed by others, the remaining competitors increase in size. it becomes ever more difficult for new, smaller companies to compete with these larger and larger businesses, as they are not able to gain such economies of scale or afford expensive startup costs. As a competitive environment, moreover, imposes threat to profit rates, existing companies have an incentive to try and seize as much market share and power over society as possible. The cumulative effect is that in markets all around the world, we've seen a tendency towards monopoly and oligopoly, and competition has in many cases been virtually eliminated. Today, these monopolies have reached such a size that of the 100 largest economies in the world, 51 are corporations, 49 are countries. The uncontrolled and unregulated free market does not work because it provides incentives for its own destruction, as it encourages concentrations of power in the hands of fewer and fewer capitalists. The free market, as theoretically conceived, cannot exist. Concentrations of power, by definition, disempower everybody else. How can individuals be expected to exercise any power via consumer preferences when they are faced with such monoliths, with more money and wealth than they could ever dream of, with which to determine resource allocation and market outcomes? My second part of my argument is about how the market is also responsible for a lot of the approaching environmental limits and crises we are facing soon. The market suffers from collective action problems. This is a situation where individual rational actions, when amalgamated, lead to an outcome which is collectively irrational. The obvious example of this is overfishing. It is in the individual interest of a fishing fleet to catch as many fish as possible to sell for profit on the market at the expense of their competitors. However, it is irrational on a collective level to do this, combined with modern trawling and dynamite fishing techniques, which is leading to a depletion of wild fisheries. At current rates, wild fish stocks will disappear entirely from the earth by 2046. This will be catastrophic, considering that 2 billion people on earth depend on fish and the oceans for protein. We need to change the rules of the game so that individual and collective rationality are aligned, and this requires the state, and in this particular case, many states together. The market is totally incapable of solving such problems. There is usually a time lag between the destruction of natural capital and the decline in ecosystem service production, meaning that long-term environmental degradation does not feature in business modelling or affect short-term profit considerations. This means that the depletion of the world's finite natural assets is treated by the market as income, while the value of the assets themselves are ignored. For example, the destruction of rainforests has several ecological, economic and societal negative implications, an obvious one being the destruction of biodiversity. It is estimated that the annual destruction of rainforests ultimately costs society the equivalent of $4.6 trillion a year, or $650 per person on the planet. But in the short term, forest cutting looks like an economic benefit, through freeing up agricultural land and the production of timber. As a result, between 1970 and 2000, 35% of the world's non-human species were driven to extinction. Similarly, market forces have resulted in the overuse and degradation of fresh water supplies. According to the UN, by 2025, about 1.8 billion people will be living in countries or regions with absolute water scarcity, and 2/3 of the world's population could be under conditions of water stress. An economy that does not heavily tax the extraction of non-renewable resources is like a jobless person rapidly spending an inheritance. The market, beyond causing these environmental problems, cannot be expected to make the massive infrastructural investments needed to solve, mitigate and adapt to them. Just one example. Runaway climate change has the potential to lead to more severe natural disasters than we have ever seen before, and with greater frequency, including droughts, floods and hurricanes. If nothing is done to reduce carbon emissions and prepare society's defences to such potentialities, in the coming decades, climate change can lead to hundreds of millions of deaths and countless refugees. Yet it is estimated that to stabilise carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, the world must cut emissions by about 60 to 70% in the next 10 to 30 years, if it isn't too late to do so already. To do this, we're going to need to instigate massive changes in our economies, including installing big wind farms, solar panels, insulating old buildings, switching the majority of trade from freight to rail, and investing in mass public transport systems, among other things. It takes government programs to implement such massive transformations, just like it has in the past. Many large-scale technological developments of the past century depended on government support during the early stages of research and development or the build-out of infrastructure. For example, the American mass production system, the aeroplane, space exploration, satellites, computer technology, the internet, and nuclear power. In conclusion, there needs to be far more government intervention in the economy, not less, because only the state can overcome destructive market forces. It has the power through regulation or more direct economic control to break up and prevent the formation of monopolies. to guarantee minimum working standards, and even to ensure that labour is treated as more than a mere commodity. To heavily tax the extraction of non-renewable resources and to prevent wastage. To direct the economy towards serving the needs of people rather than the desires of rich and powerful. And to maintain economic stability and make the infrastructural investments that we need to make the transition into a just society and a sustainable economy. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Leon for his speech and to invite all of you to take the floor.
Good evening. A few points on Leander's points. Firstly, competition for jobs. What he failed to mention was that a market operates with two sides, supply and demand. There is competition for employees as well as competition for jobs, which is why salaries and wages have risen. It's just not true that they've stayed flat at all. They've risen over the past any reasonable period that you care to look at. They haven't over the last 5 years, certainly, but over the last 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, they certainly have, especially per hour.
How much?
The next point is competition in highly regulated industries is restricted because of the regulation. It's not because of the lack of regulation. It's the restrictions on competition that lead to these oligopolies. The tragedy of the commons point about environmental destruction, fishing is a perfect example. The problem there is the lack of property rights. If no one owns something, then everyone has the incentive to trash that property. If it's owned by someone, then someone has an interest in maintaining it for the future. Environmental disasters, well, if you want environmental disasters, the best place to look for that is in countries where they've had large amounts of government intervention, such as the USSR, North Korea, and the Ukraine. Onto my points now. I'd like to address three topics. Firstly, what economists say about the most obvious government intervention, and that's tax and spend. Secondly, what the evidence demonstrates about high spending versus low spending, and therefore tax, because obviously every penny spent is a penny taxed, either now or in future. And lastly, what effects do other types of intervention have, such as regulation, trade barriers, and planning policies, if I have time for that. The American satirist and political commentator P.J. O'Rourke once said, "Giving money and power to governments is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenagers." I think that sums up the gist of what happens when the government intervenes in the economy a lot better than what I'm going to bore you with in the next few minutes. To all intents and purposes, in an economy such as ours, where the government consumes 40%, 2/5 of the national income, and it spends almost a half of it, I think we say that the motion is entirely justified. As Eamon mentioned before, very few people believe that zero intervention is optimal, but when the state is as bloated and reckless as it is at the moment, then certainly any move, almost any move towards less intervention is for the better. We looked 19 rigorous peer-reviewed papers by various distinguished economists have been reviewed in the single income tax, which is this document produced by the Taxpayers Alliance and the Institute of Directors joint project, the 2020 Tax Commission. And they all demonstrate a proven link between either high spending or high taxes on the one hand and slower economic growth on the other. They report that increasing the state's share of GDP by 1 percentage point leads to slower growth by at least 0.07% a year, most of them ranging from 0.1% to 0.15%. In other words, countries where the government has consumed 30% of GDP, for example, have enjoyed higher growth of between 1% and 1.5% every year than countries where the government has consumed 40%. Those 1% or 1.5 percentage point extra growth might not sound like a lot, but over the years they really do add up. Not only do they add up, they also multiply by each other and compound into amounts that transform people's lives. Take Hong Kong. In the decades after the war, Britain extended its intervention in her economy, and tax and spending both swelled. But in Hong Kong, officials there ignored advice from Whitehall and kept intervention at a very low level, with tax and spend gobbling up only around 15 to 20% of GDP. In the UK, it's been about double that or more. With the secure property rights and reasonably low corruption in Hong Kong, meaning that people felt confident to invest, work, and take risks, the results have been explosive. Hong Kong boomed, Britain didn't. In 1961, the average income in Britain was almost 4 times bigger than the average income in Hong Kong. It was 28% of ours then. By 1980, just 19 years later, Hong Kong had nearly caught up. British incomes then were only a quarter bigger than Hong Kong's. The trend hasn't stopped. This year, IMF per capita GDP figures show that in Hong Kong, incomes are now 40% higher than they are here. And that trend is even more stark in Singapore, where they are 67% higher than they are here. And in 1980, they were 20% lower. So the link between the two is very stark. For the Queen's Diamond Jubilee this summer, we crunched the numbers on British economic growth, and if we'd have stuck since '52 to the 33% of GDP that the Taxpayers Alliance and the IOD recommend in the single income tax, GDP incomes now would be over 90% higher than they are now. We would have basically followed the Singapore example, and it looks like I don't have time for the other subjects.
Sorry about the back of the room being plunged into darkness. So this room tends to have a kind of mood lighting effect, where the lights will come on and off almost at random. That's probably a reasonable mechanism that they use. I have no idea what it is and how to change it, so sorry. Hopefully they'll come back. Fantastic. I'd like to welcome Peter.
Thank you. Dear comrades, this evening, all we can see the result of free marketeer neoliberal policies, 9 grand fees, and they can't even turn on the bloody lights. I think University of Birmingham Debate and Society have excelled this evening in attracting comrade Eamon Butler, the founder of the most influential think tank of the past 30 years, and of course the other guy from the Tax Avoiders Alliance. Thank you. Now, as everyone will of course be aware, Adam Smith Institute was one of the key architects of the neoliberal Thatcherite project. They just turned off their lights. And of course, Adam Smith, as a fellow Scotsman, would have turned in his grave, at the ravaging effects which the free marketeers have heaped upon his homeland. Not only have they turned off the lights in the University of Birmingham, they also turned off the lights in Scotland many years ago. And I come back to speak on behalf of Adam Smith. I don't come back. If he came back, he would be speaking on behalf of Scotsmen all over Scotland. against the ravaging and crippling effects of chronic economic decline, and of course the poll tax, which the Thatcherite neoliberal free marketeers heaped upon his country. Now let's make no mistake this evening, comrades. This is not a debate between one side who believe in non-government interference and another side who believe in excessive government interference. This is not one free market side and one state-centric side of the debate. No, this is a debate between two sides who believe ardently in state intervention in the economy. This is a debate between two sides who believe that the state should continually intervene in the economy. The only question which separates us is in what types of economic activity the state should be regulated. Now, all of us in this room would come to the conclusion that the state should heavily circumscribe certain types of economic activity. For example, most of my family and friends are illicit drug dealers, having suffered 30 years of unemployment and chronic economic decline. But are they allowed to ply their black market trade to children? No, they're not. Because quite rightly, the law intervenes in order to stop certain types of economic activity. For example, the sale of drugs and alcohol to children. We all agree that the market should be regulated. But for us on the broad left, the question of what should be regulated is a moral one, not simply an economic one, as shared by our friends on the right. Because we would see many of the corrupt practices of the banks and the financial elites that the Tax Avoiders Alliance turn a blind eye to, we would see many of these corrupt practices as being every bit as morally repugnant as the sale of alcohol and drugs to children. No, our comrades on the right, they say they like freedom from state intervention, but this is a lie. This is a lie, comrades. One of the biggest myths ever perpetuated. Let's be absolutely clear. The free marketeers do not believe in a limited small state. And if they did, then 30 years of neoliberalism has done exactly the opposite. Look at the empirical legacy of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is now the dominant ideology of almost every single nation in the world. Neoliberals believe in such a limited state that every single major global political and economic institution is now dominated by neoliberalism. They believe in such a limited state that every single major societal institution is now swamped by neoliberalism. Even our universities are swamped in neoliberalism. Comrades, these people believe in excessive state intervention. Neoliberals are like the Borg from Star Trek. They swallow up and they assimilate every single institution in their wake. And there can be no resistance to the global universal reach of neoliberal assimilation. And if you do assimilate, they then use the state in order to suppress your protest. That's how limited a state neoliberals believe in. Where were the Tax Avoiders Alliance and the Adam Smith Institute when it came to protecting the freedoms of students when they were protesting against fees? Where are they? Where is the policy of the Tax Avoiders Alliance on the protest being suppressed in Greece and in Spain and in other parts of the globe? Listen, when it comes to state interventionism, my God, do neoliberals love a bit of state interventionism. Not even Stalinism could match the thirst for excessive state intervention that the neoliberals believe in. When it comes to excessive state intervention, the neoliberals make the Soviet system look like my nan. Because neoliberals intervene excessively. They intervene in order to use the World Bank and the IMF in order to push their neoliberal ideology onto developing countries. They intervene excessively in order to manipulate the tax and the benefit system to deliberately increase the gap between rich and poor. They intervene to restrict the amount of welfare protection for vulnerable groups such as the sick and the elderly. They intervene in order to restrict trade unions. And it is true, for the past 30 years, wages in the the US have remained stagnant. Now, this is not an intervention versus non-intervention debate. This is about what types of intervention we should make. And surely any normal civilized society would say that the role of government is to intervene in order to protect the security of its citizens. But when we talk about the security of its citizens, we're not talking about security against some mythical terrorist. It's not men with guns that we need security against. Because the security of the biggest threat to the security of the average British citizen is deep-seated inequality and poverty. And that's what government should be intervening in order to protect, because poverty is a violence. It is a violence against people's lives. It restricts people's life chances. Look at my homeland and Adam Smith's homeland in Scotland, where the average age is 25. Nearly there. It's 25. I had to leave Scotland at the age of 24 just to avoid death by alcoholism. On the last page. Listen, we hear weekly of school teachers having to feed malnourished children. We hear weekly of people not being able to afford to heat their houses or eat properly. There are 6,000 people in Birmingham currently getting food parcels, and that is the neoliberal free market utopia. And what should these vulnerable groups do? Who should they turn to if not the state? Who should they turn to? Bilby the Nightline Bear? Perhaps maybe they should call. Should they turn to Jim will fix it? A perfect example of what happens when responsible people give up their responsibility to look after poorer people or people less fortunate themselves. Comrades, please oppose this motion.
The time has come for audience speeches. There's some chocolate on the table in front of me, which unfortunately is not for Sally and I to snack on during the debate, but rather it is to offer some kind of prize system, which may or may not fall under the incentives these guys want, or the state handouts those guys want. So that they're available, if that changes anyone's decisions at all. I'd like to ask you to keep your speeches restricted to our time limit, which is 3 minutes. This is just because there are lots of you. Similarly, just please don't do like heckling and stuff, like to audience speeches particularly, even more so than for the panel, because lots of people in this room will be making speeches potentially for the first time, potentially as a way of like developing their skills, rather than necessarily to advance a view that other people may or may not find horrific. It's just really mean. Don't do it. Like, can't say anything more. Just trust me on that one. So, would anyone like to offer a speech in proposition? Alex. So in proposition. No one would like to. There must. Come on. There's loads of you. There we go. If you can say your name before you begin your speech, that'd be lovely.
Hi everyone. I'm Joe. I'm going to speak in proposition. Just listening to the speech that was just given in opposition to the motion, describing various means in which the conspiracy of neoliberals intervene to impose their ideology on government. Surely isn't that a form of state intervention? That's the point. We oppose this. I and I'm sure many of the free market liberals wouldn't endorse that. I think that's wrong. And to be fair, I agree with him. I think it's true. I think politicians are permeated with this idea that they can go around the world and impose their ideologies on people, and that's wrong. That's neo-imperialism. That's not what free market capitalism dictates or endorses. So the idea to equate that with free market capitalism, I think, is just like it's so wrong. It just doesn't work. It's just not by the definition of the word. It's illogical. Less intervention in the economy. Again, as the opposition was saying, about big monopolies that restrict competition, that push the proletariat and the massive faceless corporations. It's government regulation and it's government backing that allows them to do that. No monopoly tends to survive for very long if it doesn't have the backing of the government. Adam Smith said that if people of the same create themselves together in merriment and reversion, but the conversation quickly turns to a conspiracy against the public. If you get two business people together, then normally they'll start thinking of ways to restrict competition, and that's exactly what happens. And we don't approve of that. You know, people need to understand this. We don't endorse this. I don't endorse this kind of mercantile influence on government. The government should have absolutely, should not be at the beck and call of businessmen just as much as the government shouldn't intervene in the economy. That is intervention. Just because the government might appear to favour big business interests, again, that doesn't follow with what free market, the doctrines of the free market. The free market doesn't allow this. This breeds the kind of corruption that creates these problems. Thank you.
Titus reminded me also to point out our timing system, which is that you get a 1 minute warning noise, which will be like a commentator, and then a 2 minute, like, please just finish your sentence now, it's 3 minutes noise, like that. For those of you who can't count to two. Fantastic. So, would anyone like to offer a speech in opposition?
We had Rory Meakin here from the Taxpayers Alliance, and you didn't seem to really grasp the tragedy of the Commons, so that's what I'm going to talk about now. Leander spent about half of his speech talking about environmental degradation. We live in a finite world with finite resources. How on earth does free market capitalism accommodate for that? And your answer was the tragedy of the Commons, which was outlined by William Foster Lloyd in 1833, and set out an argument that if we privatised everything, we would therefore have no collective action failure problems in terms of land resource and energy and environmental resources. But William Foster Lloyd, when he outlined the tragedy of the Commons, was not around when climate change even existed. Okay, so your answer to the tragedy of the Commons problem was we will privatise it and therefore it can be managed very successfully and efficiently. But William Foster Lloyd wasn't alive during the era of climate change that we now are in, or ozone depletion, or Antarctic or Arctic depletion. And I think you'll all agree, and fisheries as well, we're talking about seas as well. All of these are good examples of where it is impossible, or nigh on impossible, for governments, states, or private enterprise to own these. How on earth does a private enterprise own the whole of the ozone layer or the whole of the atmosphere? Okay, and so Rory here outlined privatisation of the world's natural resources, and therefore we would solve all environmental degradation problems. But how on earth do you privatise the atmosphere? And that is an impossible quandary. You can't privatise the atmosphere. And therefore, it necessarily means that you need state intervention, international state intervention, to combat the very things which free market capitalism is seeking to destroy. We live in a finite world with finite resources, and that is something that the Taxpayers Alliance and the free market capitalists do not understand and do not try to understand. There is no way, shape or form that we can privatise any of these natural resources that belong to the world and do not belong to private individuals or states, which is why it is very necessary we have state intervention so we don't have a climate apocalypse. Thank you.
Would anyone like to make a speech in abstention? For those who need a degree, yes.
Right, well, what I wanted to actually hear from both sides is how they actually wanted things to change from the status quo. The proposition here seemed to think that there was this nebulous dial where you could turn intervention down and then economies would grow. In the opposition we got, let's turn the nebulous dial up and then we'll save the environment and help the poor. I don't really see this working. I'm going to give you the example of protectionism, whereas you need a specific set of circumstances where you want intervention and a specific set of circumstances where you don't. For instance, when the conditions are that you have a currently uncompetitive business with the potential to become competitive, then protectionism makes sense. For instance, in the context of Japanese cars, where protectionist policies were put in place, and now they're successful worldwide. And then you have instances where it doesn't work, such as with US market subsidies, where you have an industry that's never going to become successful simply because of the conditions back at home. So I think you see circumstances where where the same similar sort of intervention is valid in some cases and not others. And I haven't really seen from either side where they want more intervention, where they want less, and how this is actually going to help.
I think the left missed a trick completely tonight. They took an entirely state-centric approach and then attacked the right for using the state in neoliberalism. The points that Eamon raised of inefficiency absolutely stand against your argument. I mean, look at economies that have used the state to control the economy. I mean, the USSR, I hear they're doing well. The left has completely ignored the findings of Friedrich Hayek, which, like him or not, agree with him or not, there are certain elements of what he said that are correct. That bureaucracies and politicians are incredibly inefficient in planning for an economy. To use an example, the research of wind farms, which was suggested by Leander, only came about as a result of free market because there was a demand and there was industry providing innovation. You don't seem to account for that. I mean, I would recommend Leander look at something called anarcho-syndicalism to kind of reconcile his views of the left. Just but,
There's a lot of anarcho-syndicalists here.
but I think that generally winds up my point, I think.
For a speech, and invite a speaker in opposition.
Right, I'm mainly going to focus, actually entirely focus on what the first proposition said. I'm sure many of my comrades in the room will want to critique Mr. Meakin's argument, as Alice already eloquently has. You see, a lack of traditional intervention can be just as political as intervention. For example, the Conservatives want support from businesses, so they try to gain favour with groups that represent business interests, and they roll back economic policies and reduce interventions in order to gain favour. And this is no different from a group enacting an interventionist policy in order to gain favour in another group, which you said was used as an evil tool to gain favour from groups, but it can be used both ways, either with a lack of or actually doing intervention. Intervention and consequently lack of intervention are therefore equal in terms of political weaponry. Politicians, and you also said that politicians can be too far from the action, but so too can economists sat in the ivory white towers of research and academia. Would you say that you know what a person barely surviving on minimum wage, or if we got rid of intervention less than minimum wage, would want or need? It seems arrogant to assume that intervention is evil when the argument is presupposed with the notion that those such as politicians and economists who do not experience such policies cannot understand or know what most people want. As Peter's point about neoliberals, contempt for protests highlight, if intervention should be about what is best for those on the ground, then surely their views should be paramount in deciding what level of intervention is enacted, rather than representing the government as evilly intervening and ruining citizens' lives.
Remind people, I think, a bit lax about this. To state their names for their speech that will be useful for the chocolate allocation.
Naughty.
Fantastic. Any speakers in abstention? Yeah.
Hi, Julia. You speak of these 6,000 people in Birmingham that are relying on benefits, and food fair enough. I think when we first had the introduction of a welfare state, what we saw was this great thing of cradle to grave, and what that produced was this dandruff system where people abused it and went to the doctors because they now had it free for everything to the extent of dandruff. What we now have is a situation where there are 6,000 people in Birmingham relying on these food parcels, which you rightly said. How many of those really need it? I agree that there are people...
Do you want to meet some?
I do want to meet some, but I don't think that equals 6,000. I think what you're giving these people is too much reliance on the state, and in turn it's reducing the want for work.
Guys, can I remind you that however you may feel about whatever the speaker is saying, probably just don't be an elf. Like, I know that you may think that in her espousing her opinions, or indeed anyone in this room espousing their opinions, they're saying things that you find to be morally horrific. I don't think that's really brilliant excuse for that kind of behaviour. Like, chat to her afterwards. Like, maybe we're all going to the pub later, probably. Could do that then. Change people's views then. Just like shouting people down, probably not so nice. Cool. With that in mind, then, anyone would like to offer a speech in proposition? Yes.
Hello, yes, I'm Tom Pike. I'm a member of the Freedom Society. Please don't throw things at me. Basically, what I'm going to look at the practical problems of government intervention in the marketplace. What you have to have for intervention to occur is regulation. Now, this regulation is law. It has to be written up, has to be produced. And who writes this up? It's bureaucrats. It's unelected individuals who work in Whitehall, who work in ministries. Okay, they are not ministers. Again, these people are not accountable in the same way that a minister might be. They are experts, supposedly, in their fields. Ministers aren't experts because they're moved around so much. Now, when you give power to these unelected bureaucrats, you're making the assumption, and this is the assumption that is made across the left, that these bureaucrats are acting in the public interest. They are not acting in the public interest. They are acting in their own interest. Many of you have probably seen the 1980s sitcom Yes Minister. That is a fantastic example of exactly what happens in government. What you get is a situation where the bureaucrats are looking out for their own interest, just like any other individual is in the marketplace. What are their own interests? Bigger budgets. They want the biggest possible budget for their department, because the biggest possible budget they get for their department means they are more important. Secondly, they're out there to get the support of interest groups, of large corporations, of various groups out there. Therefore, by getting the support of these corporations, what they do is the corporations benefit because the legislation gets written in such a way that it helps these large oligopolies, it supports oligopolies. You also get a situation where the bureaucrats benefit, because you get this whole thing with Seven Yes Minister, or a place on the board when you retire Humphrey, that kind of situation. These bureaucrats, when they leave the civil service, they want to go into large positions. They want to go into positions where they're nice pensions, where they can get lots of money, where they're important and their lifestyle can continue. What happens in this situation then is your economy becomes steadily more inefficient, as we saw in the 1970s. And what happens is you get to a position where actually, as an inefficient economy, companies and corporations from abroad don't want to invest in you. Would you really want to invest in Greece at the moment, for example, if you have lots of money? You want to invest in an economy that you know is safe, in an economy that you know is going to give you a return. You don't do that. That creates poverty. Corporations already in that country pull out. When they pull out, you start getting job losses. And what does the left suggest that you do to fix the situation? More state intervention, giving more power to unelected bureaucrats, doing more of the thing that created the problem in the first place. And it's a paradox, and it continues. It's not a paradox, sorry. It's a very, very deadly circle that continues to a point where you get a situation like you've got in Greece, where you have a really inefficient economy that is being built up by bureaucrats acting in their own interest, and it will continue until people actually begin to realise that state intervention isn't what's needed, but it's not what people really want to hear, and that's the problem, I think, today. Thank you.